Students, faculty, staff, and members of the Dean's Council, good afternoon. It's my pleasure once again to welcome this entering class to Harvard. But on this occasion, I do so on behalf of the entire faculty here assembled of the Divinity School. We're delighted to have you all present this afternoon for the convocation that will launch the 2012-2013 academic year. The term convocation stems from the Latin word from coming together. It also translates the Greek word ecclesia, which, after consulting Wikipedia this afternoon, I learned has some significance in the history of Christianity. Sometimes it takes a while. As a social and academic practice, convocations themselves have a long history, one about which a lengthy and likely very dull book could be written. And pondering painfully the sales of my books, it occurs to me that I may just be the man for the job. The sort of convocation we hold today is a descendant of a medieval ceremony in which new students were welcomed to schools and invited to sign the university's matricula, a piece of parchment that came to include the names of all the students who had ever attended that institution. So, in a matter of moments, this ritual will transform you from mere postgraduates to matriculants at the nation's oldest, and as you can see from my Hellenistic and Latinate speech, snobbiest university. Actually, I only know 3 classical words, all of which I try to get into every speech I give in public, and I'm especially relieved that I got all 3 into this brief introduction. This year's convocation is special for a number of reasons. Among other things, it marks the formal beginning of his pontificate of our new dean, David Hempton.
Good choice of words.
It thus also distinguishes a new, and to the faculty and staff and everyone associated with HDS, a new and exciting chapter in the history of the school. And of course, it marks your arrival, the students in the audience, as you bring your enthusiasm and commitments, interests that not only animate you, but re-enliven this faculty each autumn. Most of all, then, this ceremony is about you. We happily mark today your arrival on campus. Our dean will address you above all. We will fet you afterward. On no other day until commencement will you be so uncritically celebrated by the faculty. So, as Ecclesiastes says, eat, drink, and be merry today, for next week the faculty will be grumpy. Thank you.
room was suddenly rich, and the great bay window was spawning snow, and pink roses against it, soundlessly collateral and incompatible. World is suddener than we fancy it. World is crazier, and more of it than we think, incorrigibly plural. I peel and portion a tangerine, and spit the pips, and feel the drunkenness of things being various. And the fire flames with a bubbling sound, for world is more spiteful and gay than one supposes. On the tongue, on the eyes, on the ears, in the palms of one's hands, there is more than glass between the snow and the huge roses.
My city was set on fire. My people became faceless. On my land, my breeze, on all, the estampage of the alien, with your arms interlocked behind your back. For whom were you waiting? Fire has writ large its message indelibly on the clouds.
Human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. The innocent in jails beat on their bars together. A hunger striker's father stands in the graveyard, dumb. The police widow in veils faints at the funeral home. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Call the miracle self-healing, the utter self-revealing double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain, or lightning and storm, and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its term.
To introduce today's speaker, I'd like to invite to the podium our Director of the Women's Studies in Religion program and Professor of American Religious History, Ann Braude. Ann.
It is a true honor for me to introduce today's speaker, David Neil Hempton, at the beginning of his first academic year as the 14th Dean of Harvard Divinity School. It was only 6 years ago that David crossed the wide Charles River from Boston University, where he was university professor and professor of the history of Christianity, to join our faculty as the first Alonzo MacDonald Professor of Evangelical Studies. And only 8 years before that, he crossed a somewhat larger pond to move to Boston from Queen's University, Belfast, where he had been an undergraduate and, after a doctorate at St. Andrews, eventually became professor and director of the School of Modern History. But long before David began the geographical journey that would lead to Francis Avenue, he had already begun an intellectual journey out that we can trace in his 8 books and 50 articles, a journey in which in-depth knowledge of a single location serves as a foundation for expanding circles of engagement. David's award-winning first book, Methodism and Politics in British Society, 1750 to 1850, established him as one of a group of young scholars committed to constructing a new history of the British Isles that took seriously the Celtic fringes of Great Britain, so that what had been the story of southern England came to include perspectives of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. His second book, on which he collaborated with Myrtle Hill, one of the founding figures of women's studies in Northern Ireland, applied the concern to recenter historical narratives around a broader array of sources and subjects to gender as well as geography, taking women's predominance among the laity as a critical point of departure for their study evangelical Protestantism in Ulster society. In his 1993 Cadbury Lectures, published by Oxford University Press, David made explicit his commitment begun in the first two books to maintaining attention to local contexts and human individuality as the basis for expanding frameworks of analysis toward larger and larger arenas. The books that followed would show how local and global studies depend upon each other. In two more books on Methodism, David follows that movement from its British roots through the complexities of its global and transnational impact, culminating in the 2005 publication of Methodism, Empire of the Spirit, winner of the Jesse Lee Prize. From a popular religious movement, David's interest took a biographical turn. Evangelical Disenchantment, 9 Portraits of Faith and Doubt, selected as a choice outstanding academic title in 2009, resulted from David's eclectic and multidisciplinary interests, including art, law, politics, and literature. The diverse group who grapple with evangelicalism in this book include the artist Vincent van Gogh, novelist George Eliot and James Baldwin, and the feminist reformers Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Sarah Grimke. David's most recent book is his most ambitious, The Church in the Long 18th Century, a synthesis of the expansion and transformation of Christendom that relies both on broad brushstrokes and grainy detail to shift the story of the 18th century from an exclusive focus on the European Enlightenment to a world story. Excuse me, my page is stuck together. That sees the heart religion preached both by evangelicals and by Jesuit missionaries at the center of the globalization of Christianity. The book begins by describing the extent and character of the multiple Christianities that would confront a very long-lived scholarly space visitor, a female professor of interplanetary religions who received a grant, I hope it was a big one, to study the contours of Earth Christianity from 1680 to 1820. Having imagined this interplanetary perspective on religious studies, how next to broaden one's view? Why, of course, to shoulder the responsibilities of leadership and to become dean of something that no one in that book could ever have imagined. An interreligious 21st century divinity school located in a great research university. For while David's books have won prestigious academic awards, he is not someone who never comes out of the study. His commitment to local context is not limited to his scholarship. Those of us who have worked and studied with him know that he views scholarship as a community endeavor, that he invests in the communities in which he participates, and that he sees students as the heart of the academic community. He has been voted Teacher of the Year by students both at Boston University and at Harvard Divinity School. As scholar, teacher, colleague, intellectual leader, and now as dean, David Neil Hempton brings to Harvard Divinity School a set of commitments forged in the working class neighborhoods of East Belfast, where religion's interaction with the wider culture was not a theoretical proposition, but a challenge confronted on every sidewalk. David opens this academic year with an address entitled The Fog of Religious Conflict.
Well, thanks so much for those great words and for our music and readings. Following on from Kevin, I feel especially snobbish today because not only is this the oldest university in the United States, but I wear the robes of a university that is 600 years old this year. So suck it up. Yeah, what a start. Anyway, so the fog of religious conflict, and I want to start with two quotations. One from a great hero of mine, George Eliot, the English novelist Mary Ann Evans, who writes this: "Religious ideas have the fate of melodies, which, once afloat in the world, are taken up by all sorts of instruments, some of them woefully coarse, feeble, and out of tune, until people are in danger of crying out that the melody itself is detestable." The second is 150 years later from Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, published at Harvard University Press. He writes this: "Both sides, theists and secularists, need a good dose of humility, that is realism. If the encounter between faith and humanism is carried through in this spirit, we find that both sides are fragilized, and the issue is rather reshaped in a new form. Not who is the final decisive argument in its armory, must religion crush human flourishing, must unbelief degrade human life. Rather, it appears as a matter of who can respond most profoundly and convincingly to what are ultimately commonly felt dilemmas." Refer back to those quotes a bit later on. Now, I don't know how much attention you pay to the coverage of religion offered by our leading newspapers and magazines, or in some of the blockbusting academic books that seek a much wider audience than would be reflected in, say, my royalty accounts. But in a quite probably misguided book about decanal enthusiasm, I have been reading more of this stuff than I've been accustomed to. In this admittedly limited sample of a summer's reading, I've found that most of the material can be grouped under three headings. The first is reporting on the seemingly endless supply of bad news stories about religious and ethnic conflicts throughout the world. We've had reports on conflicts between Sunni and Shiite Muslims in East Java, between radical and more moderate Muslims in the Central Russian Republic of Tatarstan, between Islamists and their opponents in Mali, between Christians and Muslims in central Nigeria, between Protestant and Catholic rioters in North Belfast, quite apart from the religious dimensions of the more widely reported conflicts in Syria and Palestine. Did you know that according to a New York Times feature on the World Health Organization, that the disease that robs the most adults of the most years of productive life is not AIDS or heart disease or cancer, but depression? And depression is particularly rife in the world's ubiquitous conflict zones. A second category of recent reporting on religion focuses on religious good news stories, which are mostly a bit quirky, but sometimes also quite endearing. For example, did you know that according to the New York Times, there's a wave of spirituality that is surging through the world of classical music? Music festivals from the depths of secular Europe to major American cities are this year putting on celebrations of sacred or spiritual music. According to this report, quite hard-nosed festival directors from Salzburg to New York are convinced that people are looking for something beyond mere rationalism or the bottom line or more cyberspace toys. They want something with heart, meaning, emotion, and connection. Above all, they want something live and capable of touching our deepest yearnings and emotions. Even the sports pages have gone spiritual. Before the Olympics, the New York Times ran a lengthy feature on Ryan Hall, the American marathon runner, whose training for the Olympics was apparently influenced by his charismatic evangelical Christian faith. From Sabbatarian training rhythms to rubbing his legs with anointed oil, and from the Trinitarian spacing of his most arduous workouts to searching out obscure biblical verses that gave him an endurance edge, Paul is a deadly serious Christian. So serious that when asked on a standard drug testing form to name his coach, Hall wrote God. When the doping official told him that he had to name a real person, Hall replied that God is a real person. Alas, this story did not have a happy ending. Hall dropped out of the Olympic marathon after 11 miles with hamstring problems. Anointed oil, it seems, only takes you so far. But at least he made it to the Olympics. A third category of reporting focuses on the apparently endless feuds between conservatives and liberals in many of the world's great religious traditions. I have read op-ed pieces eviscerating the Catholic hierarchy over its treatment of nuns and cases of sexual abuse. There are endless articles on the alleged stupidity of the Christian right in its approach to science, economics, and culture, and on its penchant for supporting ultra-conservative political candidates. Conversely, there are columns by religious conservatives on the inexorable declining popularity of all forms of liberal Christianity, which in their view has become virtually indistinguishable from purely secular liberalism. The main message from the media seems to be that conservative forms of religiosity are vibrant and popular, but narrow and unacceptable, while liberal forms of religion are positive and progressive, but somehow elitist and unpopular. Hardly a great choice. It's the first of these three categories that I've outlined in the press, religious and ethnic conflicts, that I want to address today. But on the way, I hope also to say something about the other two. As is the way with professors with specialism in the evangelical tradition, part of what I have to say is really a word of testimony. I was born into a Protestant working class family in East Belfast in the 1950s, and was the first in my family line to trot off to the local university, Queen's University Belfast, where I went up to study in 1970. I went to study English literature. Seamus Heaney was then a young lecturer in the English department, the person who wrote the beautiful poem that was beautifully read. But I soon converted to history. Over the course of my four-year degree at Queen's, there were over 1,000 people killed in what came to be known as the Troubles, among the worst 4 years of violence during the entire 30-year conflict, which ran from the 1960s to the late 1990s. My almost surreal memories of those years are of city center bombs, tit-for-tat revenge killings, young men with masks and automatic weapons in their ubiquitous paramilitary organizations, highly emotional university meetings, as in the one on the Monday after Bloody Sunday, armed soldiers and armored cars patrolling the streets, and a seemingly endless succession of funerals through wet and grey urban landscapes or deep green melancholic country lanes. The funerals were the worst. The endless cycle of raw grief seemed to symbolize the sheer pointlessness of it all. Seamus Heaney's poem poignantly captures the reality that human grief is equally painful on one side or the other. He writes, a hunger striker's father, an Irish Catholic, a hunger striker's father stands in the graveyard dumb. The police widow, Irish Protestant, in veils faints at the funeral home. During my student years, I naively thought that we were witnessing in Northern Ireland the last of the world's religious ethnic conflicts, a kind of final paroxysm of the European wars of religion, the last frontier of the Protestant Reformation, on an offshore island, off an offshore island. But of course I was wrong. Far from being the death throes of a dying phenomenon, the conflict in Northern Ireland was part of a wider international trend that has also brought destructive violence to the old Yugoslavia, the Middle East, and as we have seen from the recent news reports that I quoted earlier, to many, many parts of the world. Living through the Troubles in Ireland as a young adult was not the happiest experience of my life, and there were many times that I wished I was somewhere else. It was, however, a remarkably formative experience. It was an environment that demanded attention, serious thought, and critical self-reflection. The stakes were high. To help communicate some of the fruits of that reflection, I want to borrow from Errol Morris's famous documentary film in which former US Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam era, Robert McNamara, gave his famous 11 reflections on the fog of war. Some of these reflections have become classics of foreign policy realism. I don't know if you've seen the film, but they go like this: empathize with your enemy. Rationality will not save us. Belief and seeing are often both wrong. Never say never, and you can't change human nature. Inspired by this, I thought I would construct my own 11 reflections on religious and ethnic conflict, to which I will add some direct comments on their relevance to us and to Harvard more generally. I offer these in the knowledge that every conflict is in important ways distinctive and unique, but they're also repetitive tropes. Now, don't worry, these are brief. We'll get out of here by tomorrow easily. So, the fog of religious conflict, 11 reflections from a conflict zone. First, religious and ethnic conflicts are more complicated than you think, and are often more complicated than so-called experts also think. Problems do not become intractable if easy solutions are available. Religious conflicts often arise from a large number of interconnecting causalities: ownership of land and territory, ancient settlement patterns, competing religious or ethnic identities, differential access to economic or social power, existence of long-standing grievances reinforced by emotive symbols, rituals, and celebrations, residential and cultural separations, selective access to different information streams, competing nationalisms and political aspirations, differential senses of divine empowerment, highly selective readings of history, and so on and so on. Beware of monocausal explanations or universalizing theoretical or ideological constructions. Beware also of the condescension of outsiders who only half know what it's like to live in these kinds of places. In Northern Ireland, old colonial settlement patterns that separated Protestants and Catholics generated different religious and cultural systems and ultimately competing nationalisms by the end of the 19th century. Crudely speaking, one side saw themselves as Protestant and British, the other as Catholic and Irish. One side had most of the political and economic power, the other was discriminated against and felt alienated. One community was a minority in Northern Ireland, Roman Catholics. The other, the Protestants, was a minority on the island of Ireland. The insecurities caused by double minorities and double majorities, depending on the geographical selection of each side, helped create the vortex of conflict in Northern Ireland. 2, religious and ethnic stereotyping are powerful agents in sustaining ethnic and religious conflicts. Demonizing the other is the first important step in rendering them deserving of attack or elimination. Most stereotyping of the other has some basis in observable facts and behaviors. Otherwise, the stereotypes would not exist in the first place. But they are always horribly distorted to suit the prejudices of one side or the other. It is perhaps the most dangerous human trait in our world and needs to be confronted with relentless vigor. In Northern Ireland, Protestants thought Roman Catholics were enslaved to their church, prone to having large families, feckless when it came to work, and subversive of the state. Roman Catholics saw Protestants as stiff-necked colonists, eager for dominance, discriminatory in their exercise of power, and humorless in their cultural expressions. Both sides of stereotypes had just enough truth in them to make them work, but not enough for either side to understand the complex dynamics that sustained them. 3, violence radicalizes people. Violence is often triggered by the crossing of symbolic or real boundaries and generates a momentum of its own. One side generally has more access to state instruments of power and the other resorts to terrorism. Deaths and funerals stoke the emotional intensity and set up demands for revenge. Once conflicts start, no one knows when and how they will develop. Things may seem bad in conflict zones, but you always know they can get a whole lot worse. Think of Srebrenica, Tripoli, Aleppo, Jos, Timbuktu, Belfast, Beirut, and so on. Part of the trauma of living in conflict zones is never being quite sure how bad it's going to get. Fourth, religious and ethnic conflicts put enormous pressure on the law and on legal processes. Religious traditions often have different histories of legal interpretation and enforcement. Under pressure of violence, states often start shifting the balance between state security and individual rights, setting up special courts, internment without trial, use of informants, and so on. Much of this ends badly and makes the situation worse. Internment without trial had disastrous consequences in Northern Ireland and has sullied the reputation of the United States on the international stage. Moreover, different traditions have different views of how law should work. In Northern Ireland, for example, most Protestants supported the need for internment without trial and trials without juries. Most Catholics opposed them. What we know from legal historians is that the world's religious traditions have contributed massively to the evolution of legal frameworks, and that those legal frameworks, despite appearances to the contrary, are not as normative as we think, but rather are constructions of particular times and places. In conflict zones, as in the resolution of American elections, law is always contested territory. 5, many people inside conflict zones see the conflict as a zero-sum game. Few outside it see it that way. The most perplexing feature of conflict zones to outsiders is the apparent propensity of participants in conflicts to see their situation as a zero-sum game, worth dying for rather than a problem that needs resolving in the spirit of half a loaf is better than no bread. Naturally, the zero-sum mentality stokes violence. Stakes could not be higher. I saw a news report from Syria recently where one of the rebel combatants stated quite bluntly that he would fight to the death because there was nothing else worth living for. People who see no options for themselves are literally people without options. 6, it's easy to be wise after the event. Before conflict breaks out, things may seem entirely normal. After it breaks out, people see more clearly the structural problems that created the conflict in the first place. There's nothing inevitable about conflict, and there's nothing guaranteed about peace and stability. There's often a fragile veneer of civility in societies, which can be stripped with distressing speed and consequences. This can happen in any community, anywhere. 7, living in conflict zones requires individuals to make moral choices on a regular basis. How one works to maintain humane values in the midst of inhumane acts is a constant struggle to define one's humanity. Part of that involves serious evaluation and criticism of one's own community and traditions, perhaps even of one's own family's traditions. This can be emotionally painful and intellectually challenging. The constant struggle for understanding and empathy for those on the other side is both profoundly difficult and deeply rewarding. Finding solid ground upon which to make judgments about what is happening around you is very difficult, not least because each side has access to different media and information streams. But peacemaking begins there. 8, social and economic misery stokes conflict and makes peacemaking much more difficult. The reverse is also the case, especially economic opportunities for young people, particularly young men. Peacemaking needs to be backed by considerable economic resources. There are few things more dangerous in any society than the existence of large numbers of unemployed young males, angry about their own lives and eager for revenge, against the alleged causes of their disaffection. Hence, a serious appreciation of the economic dimensions of conflict and their resolution is vital. Money and development cannot solve ethnic and religious conflicts, but they sure can help. 9, leadership matters. Religious leaders at all levels have the capacity either to make things better or worse. Mid-level clerics in many of the conflict zones I've looked at, or self-appointed demagogues who lead communities, can have devastatingly bad influence on conflict zones. The appeal to sacred texts, historic traditions, and authenticity can set up the kind of ideological fervor that leads inexorably to violence. Fortunately, the reverse is also the case. Wise and morally courageous religious leaders can have surprisingly strong influence. Important elements of the Northern Ireland peace process were put in place by the priests of Clonard Monastery in West Belfast and by some Protestant ministers whose commitment to bridge building sometimes alienated them from their own congregations. 10, peacemaking is a process, not a result. Settlements can be refined over years, even decades, but beware of ongoing dynamics that are making problems worse. In Northern Ireland, important contributions to peacemaking were made by women's groups, by those who maintained professional standards in law, education, and medicine, by religious groups who brokered reconciliation, by creative artists who built cultural bridges, and by concerned citizens who came together for shared purposes, for example, disability and housing groups. Everyone can have a stake and a role. Everyone counts, either positively or negatively. 11, history makes you pessimistic, but very occasionally the human desire for peace and justice surprises you. As Seamus Heaney's poem states, history says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. One of the most perplexing issues I struggle with in Ireland is that a combination of a pessimistic temperament, those of you who know me know that's true, and a deep historical training in the roots of the Irish conflict made me congenitally skeptical, even cynical, about any possible way out of the conflict that did not represent the ultimate victory of one side over the other. So in dark moments, I also thought it was a zero-sum game. Things are still far from perfectly settled in Northern Ireland. Residential segregation is unacceptably high. The educational system is still divided. Structural discrimination still exists. The peace wall in Belfast is still there. Periodic bouts of rioting still take place. Some paramilitary organizations still mount bombings and shootings. And the economy lags in tandem with most of the rest of Europe. But if someone had told me in the 1970s that one day there would be a power-sharing administration in Northern Ireland, with the Protestant fundamentalist preacher Ian Paisley as the First Minister, and the one-time member of the Provisional IRA, Martin McGuinness, as Deputy First Minister, I would have questioned your sanity. They even seem to like one another. So things are better, but far from perfect. This summer I toured many of the working class districts of Protestant and Catholic Belfast. Some of the old divisive murals, flags and emblems are still there, provocatively declaring ownership of territory. But there are also some new murals paying homage to concepts of social justice, the dignity of labor, community pride and human rights. These concepts have not triumphed, but at least they're visibly there. So what use are these 11 reflections from another time and another place to Harvard Divinity School and Harvard University? First, be informed. Be religiously literate, not just in a forensic way of knowing more information about religious traditions, but globally engaged and morally committed. A graduate of Harvard College needs to understand that Muslims are killing Muslims in Syria and how religion divides them. They need to know why evangelicals support Roman Catholics on right-to-life issues, but understand that what they see is at stake very differently. We need to know why white evangelicals in the United States vote disproportionately Republican, while black evangelicals vote disproportionately Democrat. We need to know why women in many cultures seem more religious than men, and what that may mean for social and economic aid. We at HDS, in partnership with our colleagues in FAS and other schools, can help make our college graduates more religiously literate, and not just in the forensic sense. We'll have to work for it, commit to it, make it a priority of our school. It also requires courage, not just more knowledge. 2, only connect. Some of us have joint or courtesy appointments in other departments at Harvard, but all of us work across disciplines. That's the nature of religious and theological studies. And we all have colleagues, known and unknown, and partners, current or potential, in other schools and departments who can learn from us and from whom we can learn in turn. Some of us have already found partners and joint ventures with colleagues in public health, medicine, law, government, education, history, literature, political science, and so on. Can we do more to make connections with people with expertise in other areas, to lay bare the full complexity of religious traditions and their social and political contexts? Harvard, with its wide range of undergraduate disciplines and graduate schools and its unparalleled library resources, is perfectly set up for us. We need to learn how to access these resources and contribute our expertise to them. 3, don't be condescending to those in difficult situations. We're not as good or as smart as we think, even at Harvard. People do not find themselves in conflict zones because they are much more wicked and stupid than we are. That too is a stereotype. 4th, religion is not the source of all good or all bad things in culture. Despite what some of our most influential intellectuals think, do not assume that the world would necessarily be a better place without religion altogether. I saw remarkable acts of goodness, decency, heroism, and forgiveness motivated by religious faith in Northern Ireland. The press rarely reports this, and academics hardly know what to do with it. It is often the day-to-day kindnesses and considerations that can help to diffuse violence or open up the possibility for more creative dialogue between contending parties. So we should not depend on modernity and secularization to solve religious conflicts. The tide of history is not turning in that direction after all. Religion often sanctifies and legitimizes conflict, but it is almost never the sole cause. Finally, 5thly, be actively engaged peacemakers at every level and in all aspects of your lives, here and in the future. Refuse to stereotype. Think creatively about how religion works in our world and use all your talents. We are educating teachers and leaders who move on to colleges and service organizations around the country and increasingly around the world. Graduates who in turn educate more undergraduates and future leaders and citizens and religious practitioners and believers. To go back to George Eliot and Charles Taylor, which is where we started, the world remains to be convinced that religious melodies can be played with harmonious sounding instruments, or that we can, in Taylor's words, respond, quote, profoundly and convincingly to what are ultimately commonly felt dilemmas. I conclude then with the words of Seamus Heaney, whose family tradition in Northern Ireland, as it happens, was on the other side of mine. He writes, "So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells." Thank you. done. I want to thank Harry Huff and all our musicians, all our readers and participants, all our introducers. I want to thank Karen and all her staff and everyone who put a lot of energy into making this event happen. So thanks to everybody. Believe me, I have even more reason than you have to declare the 197th Convocation over. Feel convoked. Come, let's eat, drink, and be merry in the Rock Cafe. Thank you very much for coming.